one more fantastic panel, and that panel is going to be moderated by my colleague, Professor Jonathan Cordero from Cal Lutheran. He's one of the California Indian PIs on the Critical Mission Studies grant. And I think we should just move because we're a little bit behind schedule, and I'm so happy that the discussion's been vibrant and important, but I'm gonna have him introduce, and I think we're probably gonna do 4 speakers discussion, then we have a distinguished final respondent from Mexico. So I'm gonna turn things over to Professor Cordero.
All right, folks, our last panel is upon us. And I wanted to remind you all again that we are on the ancestral homeland of the Gabrielino and Tongva folks. And where's Jennifer? There she is. So Jennifer rocked her Game of Thrones sweater today, and she's got her Wonder Woman wristband on. So I had to compete and wear the hat today just to keep up appearances here. Anyway, it's my honor to introduce our final panel, which is called Mission Studies Moving Forward. And I'm going to be introducing the first 4 speakers first. And then when they're done, we'll have a little Q&A. And then we'll conclude with, well, I think this is entirely appropriate that Dr. Francisco López will close this out, and I'll introduce him before he speaks. So here is the first of our 4 speakers. I'll introduce the 4 of them, and then they'll come up. And just for the sake of time, since it's late in the day, I'll just let you come up one after another. And when you get up here, just introduce yourself and remind everyone who you are, please. So the first is Mari-Tere Álvarez, who is PhD, of course, project specialist at the J. Paul Getty Museum and associate director of USC's International Museum Institute. She has recently co-edited quite a few things, obviously. Renaissance Futurities, Art, Science, and Invention from UC Press, Remix, Changing Conversations in Museums of the Americas, also UC Press, and Beyond the Turnstile, Making the Case for Museums and Sustainable Values, and of course, the last one, Arts, Crafts, and Materials in the Age of Global Encounters, 1492 to 1800, which is a special edition of the Journal of Interdisciplinary History. Her talk is entitled Roots, Networks, and the Missions, New Documentary Avenues for Research. Our second speaker will be Cynthia Neri-Lewis, who is a PhD candidate in the History of Art Department at the University of California at Riverside. She is a professor of art history at Rio Hondo College in Whittier, where she teaches courses in the history of Mexican art and the arts of the Americas. She specializes in the colonial art of the Americas with an emphasis on the missions of Alta California and the art of the Spanish borderlands. In her research and teaching, she attempts to join the local history of California mission art with the larger narratives of North America and Spanish art history. Her dissertation is entitled Illuminated Walls of the California Missions, the Index of American Design, California Project, 1936 to 1942. Also, she is a recipient of a dissertation fellowship from the Academy of American Franciscan History, and of course has received recently a Critical Mission Studies grant. Her talk today is Native Painting as a Usable Past, the Index of American Design and Mission San Fernando, 1936 to 1937. Dr. Cynthia Velasquez Moroni earned her PhD in Museum Studies from the University of Leicester in the UK, a bachelor's degree from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and an MA in Museology from the National School of Conservation, Restoration, and Museology, where she is an associate lecturer. She has also been awarded twice the Miguel Covarrubias National Prize by the National Institute of Anthropology and History, in both 2011 and 2016. She has held various positions in museums and exhibition design firms, such as the head of learning and outreach, interpretation coordinator, and curatorial officer. She is interested in collections, history of and in museums, and museum organization and policy. Her talk today is Difficult Histories and Contact Zones in the California Missions, a museum's studies contribution to critical mission studies from a Mexican perspective. And then lastly, of our four speakers is Dr. Roberto Lint Sagarena, who is Professor of American Studies at Middlebury College and Director of Intercultural Programs. He holds degrees in art history and philosophy from the University of California at Santa Cruz and a doctorate in religion from Princeton University. His research and teaching interests center on the role of religion and religious rhetoric in the formation of racial, ethnic, and regional identities in the Americas, with particular attention to social relations resulting from inequality. He is the final talk on the panel, and his is called Repeating Colonial Narratives and the Violence of Imagined Communities. All right, that was good exercise. The last speaker I will introduce when the first four are done. So Mari-Tere, the floor is yours.
So, thank you. I mean, I just want to stop for a minute because everybody says thank you, but truly, this has been an incredible conference. There is so much that has happened, and I just want to acknowledge, thank you, Charlene, for organizing this fantastic thing. And also, thank you to Chan Noriega and the Chicano Studies Research Institute for sponsoring this, because this is incredible. These sorts of things don't happen enough in our fields. So please, let's give them a round of applause. So I am just so honored to be here. I've gotten to revisit with so many people I haven't seen in years and met new friends. And I feel much like an interloper amidst such wonderful work you're all doing. So if you'll bear with me, I'd like to take you through some of my thinking. So after 2 days of these incredible talks, if any of you need during my talk to just take a mindfulness or a rest moment, I will not be offended. I understand because you have other speakers after me that are absolutely fantastic. But today I'm going to present a story, La Princesa Favorita. And before I get into that story, it might be useful to understand how I got to this story. Early in my career, like many scholars, who were working on the theme of art market. You'll remember a few years back, everybody was on the art market. That's all anybody wanted to do in art history. And I was working on Renaissance Spain, and specifically fairs in cities like Medina del Campo. And I, like other scholars, were very interested in what art was sold at these fairs, what people were collecting, what remained. And this is an image of Medina del Campo when the fair went on in the 16th century, and all those little things you see there. Do I have a little? No, I don't have a pointer. Yes, I have a pointer. Oh, there. All those little things are just little fair stands. So the fair would operate in Medina del Campo 258 days of the year, 7 days a week. Now, what does that mean in a very Catholic country? It means when they do not stop for Mass. Mercantile business goes on, and Mass would actually take place. There's a balcony right here. So you could shop and hear Mass at the same time and fulfill all religious obligations. So art historians were very intrigued by this. And then the question was, so you'd have the Queen Isabel of Castilla would actually go shopping. The first credit cards were invented, so you didn't have to carry cash and be robbed. St. Teresa of Avila shopped here, and she bought 2 paintings we know from inventories because she said the convent was very bare, and she needed something to cover the walls of the convent. A lot of what we know, there's too much information to a degree at that time for scholars because we had inventories, wills, accounts, tax documents, and we all wanted to gather as much as possible. There was so much information, and it became very dispersed with scholars working all over, no centralized place, that it just became very overwhelming for many of the scholars. And not a lot of great centralized scholarship was being produced. Wait, I'm trying to, let me get out of the pad for a minute. Excuse me, I'm having very much technical difficulties with this crazy mouse that does what it likes.
Put it on the laptop if it's better.
Yeah, the mouse on the laptop.
Put the mouse on top of the laptop.
Oh, on top of the laptop, okay. Okay. I have this like red light up here that won't go away. Anyways, So there was so much, I'll just go on. There was so much unwieldy information, and many scholars just ended up getting very lost in the process. So I actually went to go visit the great historian, Dr. Fernando Boza, and asked him about what to do in terms of methodology at the time. And he actually discussed with me that part of the issue that he found that we were doing as art historians is we were being so geographically specific. So we would use source material and stick with things like a shopkeeper's inventory that we were actually not seeing the forest through the trees. And he suggested, why don't we start looking at libros de paso, an underused source of material by art historians. So on the screen is a libro de paso. And what the libro de pasos were transport-specific documents, were any objects that were going to be transported to be sold somewhere and wanted to escape taxation, you actually ask for un libro de paso, pass it through. And there's a, if you look on the top, it says libro de paso, it says paso, it's written kind of in pencil. This is actually for the Portuguese king, and it's for things to pass directly to Portugal without being taxed going through Spain. So this was a new source for us to look at. And the reason both actually pointed this out, he said there's one key thing with any affairs that you're dealing with in Europe at that time, is basically all transport of materials is happening by boats. That's consistent, you have a lot of materials, and you can find out a lot. So this is, on the left is from an ex-voto, 16th century in Zumaya, which was one of the towns where boats would land from Hamburg, Bruges. And on the right is actually the port of Bilbao, which you can see how many boats are just coming in. And that's just offloading merchandise. So the sorts of things that we were finding out early on, and this, which bring up what is the significance of the libros de pasos, combined with captain's logs and ship's manifests, as well as intested inventories, was quickly becoming apparent. So for instance, one of the pasos noted that there was a trunk that was holding no fewer than 41 paintings of specifically St. Jerome by Isenbrandt. So for us as art historians looking at things, instead of finding one individual object and trying to make a story, we're now finding mass objects with mass subjects, indicating there's a market and an interest, at least for 41 paintings of St. Jerome by Isenbrandt. More significantly was this gentleman, Use of Holland, who was a shoemaker living in Spain, and he requested a paso for his transit in 1519. So he had coffer number 34. He died before he could receive the transit materials. So it sat in port, which actually produced another manifest. So the coffer 34 had 11 boxes of Niño Jesuses, large scale, 25 boxes of Niño Jesuses, small scale, another 4 boxes of, and it says those listed even smaller, so they're getting small, poor Jesus. And then black coffer number 32 that's at the same port has 12 Niños de Jesuses, 9 figures of another Jesuses, even bigger. So we're getting, you can see what's transpiring. This man was buying, and these are exactly the Niños Jesuses he was buying. They were called Pupis de Malines. They came from Bruges. You find them all at auction houses now. But until the Libros de Pasos, we personally had no idea so many masks were being made and just sold and being sent to Spain at fairs. Some people know these figures a little more because they're often dressed up in church for, if you think of the, in churches, they're dressed up with very ornate gowns. Now, it wasn't a one-way way of approaching material. An empty boat always meant a bankrupt boat. So we quickly discovered hulls had to be filled constantly. It can't go out and you have an empty hull because the boat goes out, you have to fill it with something. So this created this interesting relationship. So what does that translate to? So after offloading in Bilbao and Laredo, we find manifests which onload Spanish raw wool. That wool would get offloaded to Holland. It gets transformed to cloth and a shirt. It's onloaded back, and then it's offloaded back over into Bilbao and Laredo. They put embroidery on the cloth. That gets onloaded again and sent off to France and England to be sold. And this is exactly, it's the textile scholars that really got into this very well. So you can see here, this is very specifically been identified as embroidery from Castile. They know it's wool. And they know by the weave, when they go and look in, that it's something that's produced in Holland. So now we have, through this exchange, the making of things involving different styles and different cultures. This sort of type of work or approach at tracking ships at each stop and seeing what goes on and off and its eventual effects had also started to produce profound effects for other fields. It wasn't just art history and it wasn't just history. For example, around the same time, we had people tracking the onloading and offloading or dumping of pirate materials. Specifically, I think the most famous example is actually the example of the Galapagos Islands. So if some people remember, in '94, there was a whole issue with the Galapagos because they did a bunch of genome testing. And the idea with the Galapagos is each separate island, you have different genomes that have never crossed paths. But they did testing, and they found out that one island had the long-necked turtles, another island had the saddlebacks. They did testing on saddlebacks, and lo and behold, the saddlebacks had the genome of the longnecks. And this was inexplicable. This very much bothered all the people in biology. The people working on ship transit started looking at Captain Hawkins, and what they started finding out, and people who work on pirate material know this already, so I'm just preaching to the choir, is that the pirates stopped off the Galapagos, pick up the long-necked turtles that they ate, because you can keep a turtle on a boat for a year without feeding it. It lasts a long time. It's great for these frigates. And those they didn't want, they would just throw over the side, often on another island, contaminating the other island, changing the genome of these turtles. So this sort of way of doing research, strictly by the boats, was producing interesting bits of knowledge for those of us in different fields around the same time. And this brings me to my favorite story, La Princesa Favorita. There were two ships, Princesa and Favorita, whose twice a year transversed the Pacific to stock, transport, distribute, supply, and arm missions presidios on both sides of the Pacific. So here on the screen, many of you, I'm sure you've seen this, but it comes from a book of diagrams that list about the boats and all this, and this is all the stuff they loaded onto these vessels, and you can see there's just no space. They're gonna load everything up to the hill. This is my poor map making skills. I don't think I'll be hired by the Cartography Society. But according to the 1780 Diario de Navegación, we know that twice a year is an 11-month circuit. It begins off the coast of Luzon. It stops off in the Marianas, proceeds to San Blas, which is the center of the Royal Navy, which is this jurisdiction where California falls under. From that point, it travels all the way up the coast, stopping at presidios and missions, onloading, offloading, onloading, offloading. This is an example of the type of boat you would see. It's not Princesa or it's not Favorita, but it's this type of boat. Only the frigates Princesa and Favorita were assigned to supplying and transporting materials to the jurisdiction of San Blas. And as a reminder, Princesa and Favorita are not galleons at all. They're frigates, which means they're built for durability and not speed. They're very different than galleons, and that's something that people tend to ignore. This is actually a frigate being constructed in a slipway, so you get a sense of scale. Princesa was built in San Blas and was designed to have enough storage to be able to travel a full year without need of rehauling. These are some of the supplies they would load on such ships. You can see live animals are always loaded on, anything you can think of. Also in terms of like the decoration for the ships, here is the typical what's expected in the captain and the officers. It gives you a sense of scale because if you look at the furniture, that's regular sized bedroom furniture. If you look at the bureau, the mirrors, those sorts of things, even the 4-poster bed. The material that's related to Princesa and Favorita is abundant. Each voyage, and they have a long life, has a captain log and manifest list, Logs for each material is intriguing. Each stop produces another manifest list because the ports have to, we're also trying to prevent illegal trade, even though that does happen. So there's an abundance of unexplored, the most underexplored facet that I see in this trans-Pacific study is actually on their ships. The one area that's been most studied, constantly published, is actually these letters on screen. It's the collection of the 5 letters of Cambon, which cite about him expecting a shipment from Princesa Favorita, which we've talked about, other scholars have talked about throughout the conference. Part of the reason this one's the most used is actually because these letters are in UC San Diego. But the Archivos de las Indias are filled with material, an overabundance of material on Princesa and Favorita that has been underused by scholars. As a reminder, these frigates are only successful if they're constantly loading and unloading material. An empty hull is considered a failure and ensures bankruptcy. So with all these ports, the possibilities of exchange of not only objects, but materials, which get incorporated into other objects, is truly tantalizing. So if you have a material of a certain type of timber, and you need to make room for something else, then oftentimes you unload a certain material, offload another one, and then that material will get used somehow. So you can truly see where you start getting a mix of materials and materiality that may be unexpected and surprising. Or if something didn't sell, a commission wasn't accepted, where you'll see, because this happens often with ships, that if a commission's not accepted, they may take it to the next port, sell it at half price, so someplace ends up with something that you're like, why did this end up here? It's just a matter of economics. This type of research project usually involves, I cannot stress this enough, as a research team. It's really not a one man or one girl or woman operation. And to look more closely at trans-global trade and exchange, which the missions in San Blas jurisdiction, as well as the Spanish missions in China, which Luzon, which is the starting point, has 3 Spanish missions under its jurisdiction. So of course, when they come back over from San Francisco, they're offloading and distributing out. And what they're gathering from after going through California is still material to be discovered. And I haven't even gotten to the possibilities of human trade, what people are traveling through this whole thing. Just a reminder of the Spanish missions is here's the reference. The area in China that we're talking about is that highlighted little light yellow area is what belongs to the Luzon. So in closing, because I'm already at my 20 minutes and we have a long afternoon. In closing, what makes this avenue of research truly exciting is it's very intriguing. And as a researcher for methodologies, the Trans-Pacific is very different than the research we were doing in North Atlantic. North Atlantic, we were dealing with many ships. Here, which makes this really an incredible project, is you're dealing with 2 ships for many years, Princesa and Favorita. And so you have a control, it's almost like a controlled experiment. And it makes it rich potential and to fill many blanks or enhance our current understanding of the history of the missions on both sides of the Pacific. And this is not just moving forward, but it actually takes us to moving beyond. So thank you all so much for this.
Thank you, Mari-Tere. That was fascinating. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the Tongva, the sponsors, and the organizers for welcoming me and us here this weekend. I'm honored to take part in these very important conversations about the missions and their legacy. How's everyone doing this afternoon? Thank you to the participants also for hanging in for this last session. My presentation is different than most of the others. I'm bringing us into the 20th century California, and also I used a white background because I heard that it's supposed to wake up your audience. Several visitors to the Alta California missions during the early years of the 19th century commented on their colorful interiors and illuminated walls. But most of these original wall paintings, produced by native artisans under the direction of Spanish priests or mission-trained artists, were whitewashed in the late 19th century. From 1936 to 1942, the Federal Art Project's Index of American Design was involved in the documentation and recreation of several of these mural programs. The index sought to define the nation's cultural and aesthetic identity and to provide inspiration for modern art that was distinctly American. Artists and photographers were sent to 36 states to document examples of American folk and decorative arts dating from the colonial era through 1900. Organizers conceived of the project as, quote, an index to the past of our national culture, end quote. After their secularization in the 1830s, most of the mission buildings and their visual programs fell quickly into ruin. Here's one of those images that Joanne was talking about today. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, preservation efforts had begun, but interest in mission art and architecture was for the most part a regional one. That the federally sponsored index would find the indigenous paintings of the California missions to be one of the most promising sources for a national art during the New Deal era, given the nation's conflicted relationship with its Spanish, Mexican, and Native American roots, is the unique situation I investigate. In California, index artists documented mission architecture, sculpture, furniture, metalwork, textiles, and mostly painted wall designs. The images they produced were edited and approved by regional supervisors in Los Angeles, who in turn reported to federal administrators in DC. After the Federal Arts Project ended in 1942, the records and watercolors were gathered and archived in the National Gallery, where they have remained largely unknown and unstudied for the past 77 years. I think I did the math right there. In their aim of identifying a usable past, the index sought to transform these existing mural fragments of Native American designs into national motifs. Today, I present a case study of selected wall paintings at Mission San Fernando del Rey de España, one of the first missions the index visited. I'll explain how their recreations have influenced our contemporary understandings of these mission designs, the native artisans who produced them, as well as the art historical and national value of the California missions themselves. Late 19th and early 20th century descriptions of the painted walls exist, but these are limited. Several early photographs document the mission structures, but few illustrate the walls themselves. California mission art historian Norman Neuerberg compiled a full inventory of the known wall painting designs in the 1990s, with an emphasis on identifying their European sources. The art historiography of 16th century Novo-Hispanic mission wall paintings has greatly evolved since the early 20th century, but these recently expanded or revised notions on hybridity, mimicry, and acculturation have not yet been fully applied to the study of California mission wall paintings. In fact, their study has remained grounded in the art historical framework of the 1930s. I seek to represent the original designs as part of an indigenous archive and system of knowledge, a project which challenges the national narrative created by the index. Between 1797 and 1820, about 2,000 Tongva, Chumash, and Tataviam speakers of various lineages were pulled from their villages and enslaved at the San Fernando mission. This multi-ethnic population came to be known as Fernandino. Anthropologist John Johnson explains that the introduction of the bow and arrow around 450 of the Common Era was the date early 20th century historians associated with the arrival of the Tataviam in the San Fernando and Santa Clarita valleys. The problematic association with hunting technology and the beginning of Tataviam history will be relevant to this discussion. Though their regional, linguistic, and political histories varied, the Tataviam, Tongva, and Chumash share, among many others, shared a long tradition of painted images. In the pre-mission era, the painting of rocks, caverns, floors, and bodies served as a means of accessing and shaping the sacred, and were often associated with shamanistic rituals, the ingestion of the hallucinogen toloache, and the cult of Chinich. Some of these practices survived into the mission and post-mission eras. By the 1930s, anthropologists had recorded many of the sacred rituals of the first Southern Californians. However, the California Index, who were expecting to encounter Spanish colonial design, were unarmed with any background information on the native peoples whose designs they would spend so much time documenting and recreating. In line with the New Deal emphasis on cataloging and indexing American culture and history, the artists and their supervisors understood their task to be a documentarian one. They sought to meticulously record these images, creating, and usually signing, trompe-l'oeil paintings that in the end were viewed and displayed as artworks in and of themselves. In 1936, a team of index artists were sent to Mission San Fernando, located a short distance from their headquarters in downtown Los Angeles. They began to document mission designs, as they planned to do at all the missions, but from the outset, their project took on a new dimension. In the process of preparing the walls of the Padres' house for repainting, a piece of the crumbling plaster fell, exposing earth-colored designs and patterns. After photographing the painted designs and creating watercolor renderings, the artist explorers, as they came to be called by their supervisor, continued to chip away plaster, revealing an underlayer of more colorful designs which they attributed to native artisans. In other states, index teams were documenting designs that had already been curated and collected by the supervisors and their affiliates in the respective local art and antique circles. But in California, the project had expanded from straightforward documentation to the tasks of discovery, recovery, historical research, restoration, conservation, and recreation. National Project Director Holger Cahill had envisioned the index as a kind of archaeology, a quest to dig up what he loosely described as the indigenous arts of the nation. The physical discovery of indigenous wall paintings under several thick layers of plaster at San Fernando was perfectly suited to this archaeological metaphor. Cahill had earlier made the decision to exclude Native American designs from the index project, but in a public relations sense, this discovery at San Fernando was too good to be true. In an undated report, California Index Supervisor Homer Evans wrote that the falling plaster at San Fernando had, quote, started a train of discovery of lost Indian paintings, showing the beginnings of mural art in California and uncovering designs to inspire artists of today, end quote. Oh, and then he also continued, it's an ill wind that blows no good. Thus, the Depression is making possible, among many other projects of use to American life, a revival and rediscovery of Native American arts. Warren Lemon, director of the Index in Southern California, considered the discovery at San Fernando and the subsequent indexed studies of mission wall paintings to be the state's most valuable contribution to the national project. The San Fernando discovery story and the images they found there were heavily promoted, not only in the index's official reports to DC, but in radio shows, exhibitions, and newspapers. I think you can read the headline here, American Art Comes Back to America. Experts are chipping skillfully at drab walls and paving the way for a complete portfolio of early American expression, an integral part of the nation. You can see the photos, the index photos that I just showed you there, and the Stations of the Cross, a set of paintings that had been produced at San Fernando. They also documented, they made watercolor renderings of these as well. These are now at San Gabriel Mission, the original paintings. Next, I will show you 4 of the San Fernando wall painting programs that the index chose to document and publicly promote, all based on stylistic elements and subjects they identified as Indian. Notably, all 4 were located not in the mission church, but in the Convento, or the Padres' house, which was built between 1810 and 1826. A doorway leading into the Sala of the Convento featured designs that index artist immediately honed in on, as it was the only one containing both human and animal figures. Index artist Jeffrey Holt was one who was assigned this subject, and he did at least 2 renderings of it, which I show you here. In both, an arch above the doorway is decorated with a row of triangles, with the bottom ends of the arch curling up into shapes that resemble sunburst. Directly above the painted arch are 2 figures. On the left, a simplified but naturalistic rendering of a deer presented in profile view. A black arrow pierces the deer's chest, and several drops of blood stream from it. On the right is a man dressed in a deer suit, aiming a bow and arrow toward the deer on the left. Such scenes, which the index interpreted as depictions of indigenous life, led supervisor Walter Lemon to wonder, quote, could the thoughts of this primitive Indian tribe be discovered? Were they fully Latinized, or did they persist in expressing their own ideas and favorite designs? End quote. A comparison of Holt's 2 renderings reveals key differences. In one of them, the one on your left, he's made an effort to show the state of ruin of the wood panel, the whitewash, the floor tiles, and the painted designs themselves. The rendering on the right does not show the effects of time. The painted designs are more fleshed out and detailed as if more recently painted. Because the California Index project was the only one that took on the task of physical recovery, all of their watercolors portray different temporal phases. So these are the different phases. 1, the state of the wall before chipping away the plaster. 2, what they found under the plaster. 3, a blueprint for restoration. Or 4, a document of their conservation or restoration efforts. Index supervisors called the 3rd category restoration drawings. These were attempts to illustrate the designs as they imagined they had originally appeared. Commenting on the museum's role in restoring America's ancient ruins, Benedict Anderson explained that, quote, if the museum process is to be an effective nation-building strategy, it must leave no trace of itself. The process must be invisible so that the restored objects appear to have always been as they presently observe to be. This sounds a lot like the index's definition of these restoration drawings. In the index's written reports, it's unclear which historical moment or which visual record is being described. Most of the index reports conflate the original native design with the 30s recreations. Thus, non-transparency, invisibility, and an ambiguous temporality were crucial to the index's project of nationalization. Native wall painting, and even more so, its discovery by the California Index, became such a significant focus that the director penned a special report entitled The Study of Early American Wall Painting in Southern California, in which he wrote, realism is the keynote of this hunting scene. Thusly, the motif was entered into the national record and into the history of early American art as a realistic and historical record of native hunting practices. Oh, I'm sorry. This simple interpretation served the index well. Their particular interest in wall painting is related to a broader search undertaken by early 20th century American artists and intellectuals for an artistic heritage comparable to Europe's prehistoric cave paintings. Recognizing material and design similarities between the San Fernando wall paintings and the nearby Chumash cave paintings, the index believed their discovery to be, at least indirectly, an American equivalent of Lascaux and Altamira. Indeed, the San Fernando scene matches mission-era descriptions of native California deer hunting. In his 1786 journal, La Perouse described the hunting practices of the native peoples of the Monterey Bay. He wrote that we saw an Indian with a stag's head fastened on his own, walking on all fours and pretending to graze. In this manner, they approach a herd of deer within a short distance and kill them with their arrows. That the Tataviam, Tongva, and Chumash were hunter-gatherers in the pre-contact period is undisputed by historians of ancient and early California. But it's also a fact that by the time of the mission's founding in 1797, this economy was already being transformed through their forced participation in growing crops and tending the livestock of the pobladores in nearby Los Angeles. Most likely, deer hunting for dietary sustenance was not as widely practiced within the mission environment at San Fernando in the early 19th century when the wall painting was created. Nonetheless, the index's interpretation that the scene at San Fernando was a realistic scene of hunting, comparable with Paleolithic hunting scenes, has been reinforced into the present. These conclusions they reflect an interpretive stumbling block faced by early 20th century scholars of prehistoric European cave paintings. Only in the 1980s and 90s, really, did theories related to shamanism, phosphenes, and hallucinated visions begin to emerge, replacing the long-held assumption that these were scenes of daily life. David Whitley applied these ideas to his studies of petroglyphs in Baja California, which bear comparison with the so-called deer hunt painting at San Fernando. Pertinent to the San Fernando scene is a Chumash story recorded by Kroeber in 1907. He describes the shaman Axiwalich was looking to cure himself when a bright light, Pelepel, guided him toward a hole in a cliff and through a long tunnel. At the end of the tunnel was a big house filled with animals, including deer, who cure him. In variations of this story, the rock house is filled with treasures, including bows and arrows. As Whitley notes, deer are often cited as important spirit helpers, which a shaman can transform himself into. Portals into the rock house are often guarded by rattlesnakes, as seen in diamond and zigzag patterns of rock art in the San Fernando and Santa Clarita Valley, near the mission. Following Whitley, historian Lisbeth Haas made the important connection between California rock art, shamanism, and the paintings at San Fernando, concluding that the bowman, she says, represents a metaphor for entering a trance state, such as produced in a vision quest. But what did all this mean in the space of the friar's Sala? I recently viewed the deer scene with Caroline Ward Holland, a representative of the Fernandino Tataviam Band of Mission Indians. She accepts Haas's interpretation, but adds a reading that connects past and present. She said of this image, "The ancestors were and are still showing us the way out of the mission. It's not an actual deer hunt, it's a warning. We are the hunted, being pierced by the arrow of the camouflaged priest." Fernandino Tataviam President Rudy Ortega Jr., in a recent interview, he told me that he believed the diamonds are a symbol of power and divinity. The half diamonds around the doorway, he said, are a symbol of connecting to the sacred. In another doorway in the Sala, 2 layers of designs were identified and documented by the index. The first, an arch of these same half diamonds, curl into spirals at each end, was painted around 1825. And then another layer, which you can see the laurel branches here, and a 6-petaled flower, was executed about 10 years later. Norman Neuerberg, who repainted the walls of the Sala in the 1980s, recalled that he based his restoration on 2 sets of photographs, these this one here by the index, and a set taken after a separately funded 1940 restoration. He said that he didn't use the index's drawings because he doubted their accuracy. How does this at least tri-layered palimpsest function? At which stage was the original bowman produced? You can see a faint trace of the bowman in the index photograph. So I have this question, why did Neuerberg include it in his later restorations, but the index eliminated it in their watercolors? Excuse me. The index also documented this scene painted above a doorway in the Sala. Several shirtless men stand below a large grapevine. The Christian interpretations, the parable of the vineyard, the wine symbolizing the blood of Christ are obvious, but what did this biblical trope signify for the native viewers and makers? Angelica Afanador Pujol, in her study of the 16th century colonial manuscript El Relación de Michoacán, points out mimicry's value to the colonial subject. The native use of mimicry, she argues, was not a passive act, but an active appropriation and transformation of a European sign into a new signifier. Did the native artisans at San Fernando likewise attach their own meanings to the Christian grapevine motif and to the flowers that spring out from the doorway? Native and Christian meanings aside for a moment, it's easy to understand the index's focus on this particular image. The aestheticization of labor into a painted motif corresponds with the larger New Deal arts agenda. Like WPA murals of people harvesting crops, the idyllic, romanticized scenes of primitive Indians harvesting giant fruit could serve as a model for Anglo-Americans struggling during the Depression. This is what a recent restoration based on Norman Neuerberg's drawings, where you can see he added to the women, the female figures. Those are not in the index renderings. In 1935, FDR had established the Indian Office with Commissioner John Collier at its helm. Collier thought of America as a time-drowned continent, with Native Americans positioned in a timeless realm at its mountain peak. He believed that when the US realized the failure of its social, spiritual, political, and temporal systems, it would turn to Native Americans for solutions. Holger Cahill, the FAP and index director, also commented on this shift of perception of Native Americans from, quote, a strange and ferocious creature, utterly oblivious to any need for economic activity, to a peaceful, industrious figure, a child of nature, close to the soil from which he wins his living, cultivating the earth with a hoe, hunting wild creatures, and living with his tribe in a free democratic association, end quote. The index's selection and promotion of these particular images firmly situate Native Californians on this timeless mountain peak. In 1935, Congress created the Indian Arts and Crafts Board, also led by Collier and informed by a similar brand of romantic primitivism. While the relationship between the policies of these contemporaneous federal art programs has not been studied, a key difference is worth noting here. While the IACB enlisted Native artists, like you see on the left, the index did not enlist Native artists, thus separating the designs from their makers. The index renderings document their imaginings of the hunter-gatherer, frozen with bow and arrow at the beginning of Native time. In a national sense, Native craft could evolve, but Native design was relegated to the past, now only accessible and useful to modern artists. Above, this is the last of the ones they focused on, above another outer doorway into the convento, the index removed layers of whitewash to reveal designs which they identified as oyas with native flowers. Why did the index identify the flowers and the shell as native? Did they recognize these as toloache? They don't really go into interpretation, but they're very clear about this label, saying that these are oyas and these are native flowers. In her study of 16th century Mexican convento frescoes and sculpture, Eleanor Wake presented the idea of mural painting as a frame or conduit for understanding the media within or surrounding it. Could these floral designs be what she calls framing rituals, flower-framed spaces in which the indigenous sacred could be called or enacted? After the index's team departure from this mission, Mark Raymond Harrington of the Southwest Museum led wall painting restoration efforts here in 1940. Several, but not all of these, were based on index renderings. These restorations were destroyed in the 1971 earthquake. Norman Neuerberg repainted most of the walls in the late 1980s in preparation for a papal visit, but these were destroyed in the 1994 earthquake. Still, the San Fernando designs survive. if only in the latest poorly executed restorations and in archival storage boxes in the nation's capital. This is the end, I promise. Following their visits to California, the index produced Mission Motifs, a set of prints based on their watercolors. On the San Fernando page, multiple designs are arranged in a composition resembling an arched window, creating the effect of an Islamic mirador. Through the window, a view of the arcade of the convento is visible. Above and flanking the window are designs from the different convento walls. Through achronic assemblage, the history of each mission is reduced to one page of streamlined modern designs. Indian past and Anglo-American present have been collapsed. This is a visual representation of the writing of mission art history from the US perspective in the 1930s. Selected, aestheticized, erased of pigment, reframed, removed from native experience and meaning. These are the processes through which a usable native past was created. The mission walls, in fact, have been the site of a transcultural process that began in the mission era and through the modern afterlives of their painted designs continues until this day. As I move forward, I question the nature and function of this American archive. Was the California Index a project of inclusion, possession, or both? How can this American Art Index be revised and reactivated? And who might find these native designs usable in the 21st century? Thanks.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you to the organizers and to the Tonga community as well. And Cynthia's presentation took us to the 20th century, and it is now my turn to take us to the 21st century. I also have a white background. And in this last panel on moving forward, I'd like to talk about how I think museum studies and the Mexican perspective could contribute to this emerging field. And the first thing I'd like to mention is that following Aleida Asman's ideas on cultural memory, some pasts are more present than other pasts. And this has to do with how societies think they're contemporary or relevant to themselves. And it doesn't have to do with how long ago they occurred. And I want to argue that colonization and conquest are really present pasts. And I have here three very short examples of how this happens. For example, you can see in the screen two photographs from three different inscriptions. These are outside Templo de la Cruz in Querétaro, which is like the Colegio de Propaganda Fide, where all colonization in the Sierra Gorda took place by Junípero Serra. And it's very interesting to see how language has changed. So in 1983, they're talking about doing a homage to those missionaries that expanded culture and civilization. In 1992, the language was a bit more conciliatory. Of course, it was in the context of the 500th anniversary of the discovery of America. And so it's this discourse of mestizaje and hybridity and alienation. But then, very worryingly, in 2019, a new plaque was placed, and it says, in the memory of the heroic missionaries that for centuries took civilization to other regions of America. And this is something I find very troubling in 2019, because I thought we had really gone beyond these ideas of culture and civilization being only Western. It turns it's not, and it's there. It's subtle, but it's there. Let's move on to other more visible example, canonization of Junípero Serra. We talked about this briefly yesterday. And of course, it is very problematic. And of course, it can be understood as, he can be understood as the first Catholic saint from United States, but he could also be, or he can also be considered a genocide. And this happened in 2015. Of course, there was a range of responses across all sides of the political spectrum. A third example, also mentioned yesterday. Recently, Mexico's president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, well, in March, sent a private letter to both the king and prime ministers in Spain asking for an apology for the conquest. And it created huge tensions and debate, not only in Spain, but in Mexico, across the political spectrum. I just read yesterday that the saga continues, and most likely it's going to continue because next August we will commemorate the 500th anniversary of the fall of Tenochtitlan. So if anything, this is going to get more problematic. So I think what we're dealing with is a past which is very present, but I think we can term it a difficult history, a difficult heritage. And I'm following here Sharon McDonald's idea of a past which is meaningful today, but that is also very contested and awkward and problematic for contemporary processes of identity and positive reconciliation. So that being, I think that's the first set of ideas I'd like to share with you so that we can frame the sort of ideas I'll now turn to address. The very long title of my presentation mentions how I think museum studies and Mexico could contribute. So I'd like now to move on and talk a little bit more about, let's say, these two strands. And the first one is the place from which I'm looking at critical mission studies. And of course, that is a Mexican side of things, the Mexican perspective of things. And yeah, I can say there is a broad and really wide research on missions because missions constitute a very important part of the history of northern central Mexico and Mexico in general. But as I said, there is a very particular context of discussion about the anniversary of the conquest, and this really changes many of the things we would like to do or intend to do. But there is an institutional framework, and there is also a particular historical culture, and that has to do with how pervasive in Mexico is the idea of the mestizo culture, of Mexico being the result of an indigenous strand and a Hispanic strand, and therefore Mexico being a modern nation which resulted of this mestizaje. That really affects how we frame heritage, how we frame historical discussions, how we approach issues, because this conciliatory discourse and narratives impact on to what extent we pull on changes or not. And then, of course, Mexico is a very strongly secular state in a very Catholic country. The fact that we have a huge centralizing institution such as INA, the National Institute for Anthropology and History, creates a very particular or different context in terms the types of historical discourses that are disseminated, produced, accepted. which of course is a very different context from the United States, where there is of course extensive, really extensive research on the missions. But then there are specific traits, of course, like California, and it's been said throughout the day, yesterday, it has a very particular history in terms of a territory that has been multicultural throughout its history, or at least in its modern history, and a territory that once belonged to New Spain and then became part of a totally different context. Secularization was reversed. So as a result of that, today, 19 of the 21 missions are run by the Catholic diocese. And this creates a very, very different institutional framework to operate, to try to effect change, to try to implement whatever sort of consultations we want to have. Is very important to understand these frameworks if we are about to think what comes next. And I also think that the fact that there isn't this like mestizo, this pervasive mestizo ideology, creates a different reading of missions, and therefore it seems to be that there is a more polarized landscape of production, going from the fantasy Hispanic past to critical mission studies and all the in-between sort of places. Well, despite those two very different contexts, there are also, of course, similarities. And one of them, for example, is to see how pervasive are still those discourses which we thought we had overcome. For example, in Kurt Bear's classic Architecture in California from more than 50 years ago, he talks about the romantic history and exciting history. And very disturbingly, he talks about the truly black chapters of the history of California being the despoilment of the missions and the scattering of the once protected Indians, right? But I mean, this was written 50-something years ago. But then you look at a book from 2008 by a very famous historian who recently passed away, Leon Portilla, in a book from 10 years ago. And in his introduction, he talks, as regards the missions in Baja California, as a geography of hope. And I'm sure that many people would find that very troubling, about the only weapons being faith and stamina. Or then another article in that same book talking in this very managerial discourse of how missions were, a productive side managed, or where neophytes or newcomers were instructed. And so it makes you look differently at things you thought were sort of evident. And therefore, this presentation really intends to be a cause for the initiative Charlene Critical Mission Studies have in terms of thinking how that shared history becomes a shared present for all of us, because both Mexico and the USA will have to deal with how, despite our different historical cultures and heritage infrastructures, we have to deal with new ways to address and interpret the missions. Now, that's for the Mexican-American side of things. Now, the museum side of things. And I think it's an area of research which has lots to contribute to critical mission studies, because it has walked an intensive path the last 30 years. And it started in the so-called times of the new museology with a questioning of things that were so evident, such as the neutrality of the museum or its apparent benevolence. And So there started to be a lot of discussion about how political museums were and their discourses, how hierarchical they operated, and of course, how there was a need to incorporate other views, other approaches of the objects of their context, and very significantly, the need to establish different, more organic and horizontal relationship with communities. And in this context, James Clifford put forward his idea of the museum as a contact zone, based, of course, in Marie-Louise Pratt's ideas of the contact zone. And there, he stated how museums needed to be understood as places where entities or agents from different positions that had never been together at the same time could come together and establish a series of negotiations, debates, and as a result of that, be transformed. But of course, things aren't that easy to change. And the last 10 years or so have seen in the museum studies field a really self-critical time of debate in terms of how much have we been successful in following the ideas we had about the new museology. And it turns out that we can't be very celebratory because we really haven't moved forward as much. Museums continue to be very hierarchical institutions. We haven't really shared authority nor power. Communities are not participating, or when they are participating is with quotes. That meaning very often they are fetishized, used like a tick to say that the museum is working with, so it's like a politically correct shortcut. And of course, we need to have that discussions whether we are serious or not with effecting change. And that's where museums are starting to discuss whether they should be more active or whether museums should be activists. And of course, this means looking at museums as an organization from inside to very dark places that we were not aware. Because it turns out that we want to change the outside, we need to change from the inside first. And I think it's very important to bring again Clifford's ideas about the contact zone, because back in 1997, when he first stated them, he could already see the need to walk that extra step. He claimed how important it was not only to consult, but to actually bring other political agendas into the museum. And he also mentioned how museums needed to become active collaborators and sharing of authority. Let's not forget, he wrote this in 1997, about 30-something years ago. And of course, he was very clear. It's not enough for museums to represent, and it's not enough for museums to represent completely or accurately. We need museums to be accountable, and we need for them to act on behalf of communities. But this has huge implications for any institutions. So in this conference of critical mission studies and where can we move forward, speaking from the point of view of museums and missions, most of them have museums, I think it's very important to ask, if we want to create these contact zones as spaces to encounter each other, to be changed by that contact, to negotiate our difficult histories and heritage, complex processes will arise. And are we prepared, is museum staff at the missions prepared to deal with these encounters? So, of course, I want to think there's always a way out. We're a lot of people already thinking about this. And I wanted to finish with ideas, a few ideas of how can we think we could move forward. And that's why I chose this great photograph from Wikicommons, which said Indian Gardener's Adobe House, which has this tiny house over there. And it made me think, how many histories are there really waiting to be recovered and told, but ask from us to change how we operate. So 3 very specific ways in which I think we could move things forward. The first one is, yes, I do think critical mission studies could use many of the tools and approaches that have been used by museum studies throughout the years, and that have been improved and worked upon and reflected, and they're there to be used. Of course, visitor studies is key. Like, if we want to change people's perceptions on things, we need to understand, first of all, what's happening with them, how they are perceiving things, and then think about designing new behaviors and responses. But then there is also all the range of things as regards interpretation and objects. There has been a lot about object history in here, and yes, I do believe in the magic of objects as museums' key assets to sort of embrace and open the door to the many ways in which we experience the past. But that means being very creative, very responsible in the way we tell other histories and other views. And to do so, we can also use the wide research that has been lately done on emotions and emotional scaffolding in museums. If we are going to, if we know that these are difficult histories, and we saw it yesterday, we have to be very sensible in how we build that connection, sustain it, and sort of avoid or frame confrontation in the right way. Here in the USA, there's great research about how that emotional scaffolding can be done, and they done it in the plantations, sites, historic sites that were also very, very heavy in terms of there being, again, a fantasy narrative of white democratic men, and then the contradiction of having hundreds of slaves themselves. So these paths have been walked, and they are there to be used. And of course, consultation and co-curation. Like, museums have really messed up with this for many decades, and precisely because of that, as Lilian was saying, they've become better at it. Like, there are ways of doing it. Of course, each one is different, but there are ways in which this can be negotiated and done. And to do so, I think the second range of things that critical mission studies could use are related to organizational studies, because we need to understand missions like with a zoom in. Of course, the 21 of them belong to a historical unity, shared experience in some things, but each one of them is also very unique in terms of the particular, for example, indigenous communities that were originally there, how they responded to the missions, the history that happened decades or centuries afterwards, the migration patterns of today, whatever economic activities in the area. Each one is different, and we need to understand how they operate. For example, how are decision-making processes happening? Who's the board? Who are the stakeholders? What are their policies and guidelines? Do they have them? And this goes, for example, for collection. Yesterday, we were talking about how many of them don't even have like inventories. Because all this information is going to be essential to gauge to what extent change is possible in each one of those institutions. It's very hard, but we really need to evaluate whether we will be hitting ourselves against the wall now, or perhaps not, or in which missions do we focus our efforts? Is there a culture for change? If so, let's go there and plan an organizational change in the medium and long term. But this is something that needs to be carried out with sensibility, with planning, and I do think that all these issues that might seem so far away from the discussions we sort of seem to be having now are essential to try to effect any change. And last of all, yes, I do think that it's essential to collaborate with other institutions and, of course, Mexico, not only because, as I said, we have a shared geopolitical history, but because we also have a shared geopolitical present, and the contact with the other really changes the way we see each other. For me, personally, this whole conference has been a contact zone in itself, because the way I now see the missions in Mexico is very different from the way I framed them before coming. And in that process, I now think of the many things we have to do here and that we could also do here that are waiting to be discussed and brought about. So I do thank everybody for the exchange in this contact zone, which of course hasn't been easy. But I'd love to follow the conversation. You can find me on Twitter or write me an email, and that'll be all from me. Thank you very much.
This is it. Well, almost, right? We have to wrap it up. I want to tell you all how gratifying it is to be among my people. And what I mean by that is that when I taught at USC, talking about the missions was often perceived as provincial by some of my colleagues. And now that I'm on the East Coast, the missions are almost unexplainably exotic to people on the East Coast. So I'm not going to give you a lot of new information. I have no PowerPoint. I'm using a black screen. I'm going to abbreviate centuries of history, but this is all in the pursuit, hopefully, of a broader point. And I want to say that I do so as a dual US-Mexican citizen with a deeply ambivalent sense of the California I grew up in. I moved away right after Proposition 187 was passed, was gone for 5 years, returned, taught at USC, and fled to Vermont, where I now teach at Middlebury, a small liberal arts college. And I live in a French colonial barn from the 1700s that I turned into a house. Anyway, enough of that. As you all know, in a social sense, the Alta California missions were imagined communities created by Spanish Franciscans, and a century later were reimagined as civic monuments for an emerging, principally white Protestant regional community. On the other hand, newly independent 19th century Mexicans and 20th century Chicanas and Chicanos, bringing the patria north to the north here, made use of indigenismo to imagine their California communities. While oppositional in who they claim as ancestors, these imagined communities have a great deal in common. They're interrelated. They both made use, or they all made use of earlier conflicts to frame themselves. Spanish colonial communities were built with the lessons of the Reconquista. Independent Mexicans understood their imagined national community as a reconquest by the Mexicas against the Spanish. This is in a metaphorical way. Anglo-American imperialists saw themselves as more capable colonial Spaniards conquering Aztec Mexicans. And nascent Chicanx nationalism turned back to indigenista tropes. Imagined communities, particularly colonial and imperial ones, rely on the invention of traditions that empower its beneficiaries and provide shared social norms that encourage belief in the legitimacy of that power. I'm going to rely here on Eric Hobsbawm's definition of invented traditions. They are sets of practices normally governed by or tacitly accepted rules of a ritual or symbolic nature which seek to inculcate certain values and norms of behavior by repetition, which automatically implies a continuity with a suitable historical past. So if you're going to have an invented tradition, an invented community or imagined community, you need to have invented traditions that support that. So in the case of colonialism and imperialism, the suitability of the invented historic past is crucial to its power, as it must justify acts that are likely contrary to obvious facts, to previous history, or even to the settlers' stated moral values. This becomes exponentially complicated in borderlands where interests of colonies, former colonies, and nation states overlap and come into conflict. As a result of dislocations and global migrations, these contact zones are also often places where marginalized non-native groups seek equity and recognition even as they inhabit indigenous lands. This is all certainly the case in California, where public culture is a palimpsest of invented traditions that have had very real social consequences. Spanish colonial rearticulations of crusaders and conquistadores' just war theology became the basis for traditions that produced the justification for taking lands, goods, souls, and bodies in the Americas. It had been so in the past and was justified through discovery doctrines. These are the invented tradition that occurred over centuries. As everyone in the room knows, the Alta California missions were founded initially to defend the Spanish frontier against Russian and British predations. The document that ordered their establishment, the Reglamento de la Nueva California in 1773, also contained the orders for their transfer to civil rule and emphasized the need for prompt urban settlement. The colonial imaginary set the goal that well within a generation, indigenous lands would be taken and become a settled northern buffer for New Spain. In theory, converted neophytes would become part of the imagined Christian community, albeit as exploited labor with limited rights. As a quick aside, an element in the establishment of the missions that has been discussed by several participants is the Pious Fund of the Californias. Sorry, I'm very parched. Goat entrails, or what were we drinking yesterday? Anyway, the Pious Fund of the Californias. As many of you know, it was established in 1697 to allow wealthy donors to promote the Jesuit missionization of Baja California, and later to extend support to the first Franciscan missions of Alta California. The Pious Fund allowed Iberian elites far from California to imagine themselves as participants in the Catholic Californian colonial project. So this imagined Californian missionary community was in some ways global. I will return to the Pious Fund's very significant impact on the way that the missions were understood by Americans shortly. Several have commented on the relative brevity of the Spanish colonial period. It was brief and ended with Mexican independence, which was contemporaneous to the construction of the last mission, Solano. With independence, the challenge of getting colonial frontier Californios to become Mexican encouraged the use of nationalist indigenista idioms to try to forge greater links to the rest of the new nation. Just very briefly, I'll talk about indigenismo in Mexico in a very compressed way. There are nuances that I want to acknowledge that Mexican indigenismo is a complex topic with lots of historical and philosophical idiosyncrasies, but I will generalize. Early chroniclers of New Spain appropriated and reinvented Mesoamerican indigenous pasts through the lens of Christian theology and European values, creating one important strand of Mexican indigenismo. Throughout the 3 centuries of colonial rule in New Spain, a large register of influential liberal criollo priests portrayed pre-Columbian Aztec culture, and I'm going to use the word Aztec when I'm talking about a fantastical sense of these people, and Mexica when we're talking about the actual folks. As an equivalent classical antiquity for New Spain, regularly comparing the Aztec Empire to those of the Greeks and Romans, often quite favorably. Aztec rulers were seen as inspiring figures who personified classic virtues. Pre-Columbian indigenous governance was often cast in the same light as the Athenian Senate, and by the late 19th century, the quest for a national art would come to embrace a classicist visual vocabulary in the portrayal of indigenous figures. The appropriation and elevation of imagined Aztec culture allowed criollos, and also mestizos, to claim a new world heritage and history equivalent to that of Europe. The homogenization of indigenous culture through a focus on the Aztec Empire also worked to distance this invented tradition from contemporary indigenous peoples, their treatment, and their struggles. Even as they romanticized the pre-Columbian past, indigenista clergy commonly understood indigenous religions as corruptions of Christianity. A literal interpretation of Scripture made it necessary for at least one of the apostles to have evangelized the Americas centuries before the arrival of Spaniards, reasoning that if Jesus had sent his apostles to preach the gospel throughout the world, then surely God would not have allowed the peoples of the Americas to remain ignorant of Christianity. This argument was supported by the popular idea that the Americans had originally been evangelized by the apostle St. Thomas, whom some indigenistas argued was clearly corrupted into the idea of Quetzalcoatl, and this allowed for the recognition of the glories of indigenous religion as long as these glories were the product of the intervention of a Christian apostle. The fathers of Mexican independence, priests Miguel Hidalgo and José María Morelos, regularly portrayed the revolution as an indigenous reconquista, their word, of Mexico, combining indigenismo with the military language of imperial Spain. As Hidalgo and other nationalists rejected the colonial designation of New Spain, they adopted, in this early revolutionary period, the Nahuatl term Anahuac, that originally referred to the valley of Tenochtitlan at the heart of the Mexica Empire, using it to speak of all Mexico. In 1813, Morelos convened the first Mexican Congress, El Congreso de Anahuac, and asserted national independence from Spain. Imaginatively connecting the declaration of Mexican independence to the Aztec past, he solemnly pronounced to his fellow revolutionaries that nearly 300 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan, we are about to reestablish the Mexican Empire. Here in Alta California, indigenista nationalism found expression when a Mexican territorial government was formed to replace Spanish colonial governance. The newly appointed governor, José María de Chandia, fresh from central Mexico, attempted to link this northernmost region with the nation-state's imagined Aztec patrimony. On July 7th, 1827, Echandia and the governing deputation he had assembled approved a plan to change the name of Alta California to that of the Mexica Emperor Moctezuma. This renamed territory was to be given a coat of arms that would display an olive and an oak tree on its sides, containing in its center the figure of a plumed Indian with a bow and quiver crossing the Straits of Anian. This is the Bering Straits. The image of crossing the strait suggested that while the region was peripheral to the Valley of Mexico today, it was the site of the original passage of indigenous peoples into the Americas, and as such, an important part of the nation's heritage. By becoming an originary site of the Aztec/Mexica past, the formerly Spanish territory of California could become Mexican. The cost of this recognition and valorization of indigenous cultures, the cost of this was the recognition and valorization of the people that continued to exist here. The idea was approved by the territorial government, and the request was sent to the capital, but I have found no mention of what happened to the idea after that. So this is, I think, going to call for a trip to the Archivo General. Yeah, that's right. So, you know, tomorrow we could be living in, our license plates will say Moctezuma. Shortly after came war. The United States' aggressive colonial expansion took place shortly after the fall of Spain's empire in the Americas and Mexican independence. With war against Mexico, many Americans saw their country as eclipsing colonial Spain, but following in its imperial footsteps. This was a vision supported by the acquisition of Florida from Spain, the premises of the Monroe Doctrine, the rhetoric of manifest destiny, and the conquest of the halls of the Montezumas during the occupation of Mexico City. Shortly after the war, California's large-scale non-native settlement was spurred strategically by the gold rush, but the beginning of the Americanization of the formerly Spanish and Mexican missions occurred during a series of lawsuits around the ownership of the Pious Fund. In 1853, American Bishop Alemany of California, the first American bishop, traveled to Mexico City and demanded that satisfaction be made to our church in California, that as successor to Bishop Garcia Diego, I justly demanded for my own missions and for my church what Mexico owed from the Pious Fund to my diocese. The Mexican response was predictably cool, reminding the bishop that the church in California was no longer actively pursuing the conversion of pagans, the stated purpose of the fund. Also, long before this, the fund had been drained entirely by successive Mexican administrations. Upon his return to the United States from this disappointing trip, the bishop sought the counsel of attorney John Thomas Doyle to assess the possibility of legal recourse against the government of Mexico for the recovery of the Pious Fund. It took until 1870, but the case was brought before the mixed American and Mexican Claims Commission in Washington, D.C. The Pious Fund case put post-war mission historiography on trial. Both Doyle, representing California's Catholic bishops, and Manuel Aspiros, the counsel for the Mexican government, were avid historians, and the case proceeded slowly as each side presented competing interpretations of reams of colonial documents and receipts. This sounds like a dissertation defense or something. It took 5 years of deliberations for the case to be resolved. The final opinion of Manuel de Zamacona, the Mexican Claims Commissioner co-presiding in the case, was a strong critique of Doyle's reading of California history. He argued that the American interpretation was flawed because it rested on two fallacies. First, that Americans wrongly believed that the missionary work supported by the fund was a strictly religious undertaking, and therefore the American church was a legitimate successor. Aspiros pointed out this was not just the church's money. There was no separation between religious and the temporal aims of missionization. The second fallacy he cited was that the American claimants believed that they were heirs to the Pious Fund that had in fact served to secure the Mexican frontier against predators like them. He argued that the American Catholic Church did not constitute a legitimate successor to the Mexican Church in California, precisely because it inherited its position as a result of war. Unsurprisingly, the fact that the case was heard only by two commissioners, one Mexican and one American, meant that their decision came down to a tie along national lines. Sir Edward Thornton, the ambassador to the United States from Great Britain, was asked to act as an umpire and cast a tie-breaking opinion. In November of 1875, Thornton sided with the American commissioner in favor of the American Catholic Church. So I just want to pause here for a second. They've sued Mexico for the Pious Fund to fund the missions that were won through war, or we did, I should say. The net amount awarded to Alemany's archdiocese was 904,070 Mexican gold dollars, which the Mexican government paid in full over 13 years. However, we are a truly litigious country. In 1902, the issue of unpaid interest on the Pious Fund was brought before the Arbitration Tribunal of The Hague, and Mexico was once again made liable for payment, this time in the amount of 43,050.99 Mexican pesos that were to be paid annually in perpetuity. So this actually ended in an agreement that the countries arrived at in 1967, and I'm dating myself here, that's the year I was born. So Mexico was made to pay for the Pious Fund, for what's that, 3/4 of a century. While the financial award was an important gain for the coffers of the American Catholic Church in California, the Pious Fund case had a broader impact by further securing the two historical fallacies cited by Zamacona into the American understanding of the history of the missions. It had now been established, with the authority of an international tribunal, that California's Spanish missionaries were pious men whose deeds and ambitions were wholly religious and distinct from those of the Spanish and Mexican civil authorities. Moreover, the American Catholic Church, and by extension all Americans in California, could see themselves as legitimate heirs to the missions after a period of secularization and decay under Mexican rule. The fact that the Pious Fund case coincided closely with the 100th anniversaries of several missions provided the opportunity to publicly circulate these newly endorsed versions of California's history and begin to create what we now call the mission myth. That is, a unifying narrative that allowed Anglos to begin to invent a new Californian community. By the 1880s, the term Californian came to designate Anglo settlers, not Californios, as it had previously. Anglo-Californians began to concertedly claim the missions as their own and turn the Catholic missions into civic monuments after an effort spearheaded almost entirely by white Anglo-Protestants. I could add Methodist and Republican to that description as well. I haven't figured out what, but it's odd. I mean, a lot of these preservationists are Methodists, and somebody else, I brought up a Methodist angle earlier today. Yeah, I don't know what, yeah, I need something for me to look into. The Spanish Franciscans were compared to and equated with English Puritans, and for the first time, elements of Catholic history were brought into the larger fold of the United States national history. A powerful combination of cultural and economic interests worked hand in hand to promote this ecumenical invented tradition and saw to its dissemination through the novel Ramona, railroad-sponsored travel literature, as well as in architectural styles and performative expressions such as theatrical productions and citywide pageants. I want to return to our discussion from yesterday about fourth grade curricula. The reason that the missions are studied at that grade is because experts in child development decided long ago that that's the age when children are first able to understand civics and local history, to really think beyond themselves and understand that they are part of a community. By the turn of the 20th century, young school children in California were gaining their understanding, this is like 1904, were gaining their understanding of the missions from short travel essays that Helen Hunt Jackson had written prior to writing Ramona. It seems to me that the problem is more than just about the inaccurate understanding of the missions that is given to children, though that is central. The issue is that this is the point of the introduction of the anchor narrative for dominant Southern Californian civic culture. Sugar Cube missions elevate whiteness, paternalistic Christianity, and imply the passing or relative irrelevance of indigenous people. The lessons connect the contemporary U.S. that the children inhabit to the colonial Spanish missionaries while eliding Mexicans and the Mexican period. It is the moment of inculcation of the mission myth and perhaps a very concrete place where the critical study of the missions could make a significant difference. Acculturating the youth is a powerful missionary conversion strategy. Scholars and activists working to include critical mission history would help to undo a central harmful narrative with considerable social impact. So saying use the missionaries' strategies against them. The first significant public challenge to the invented Anglo mission fantasy, apart from criticisms like Carrie McWilliams, came as the result of changing political tides resulting in large-scale migration to the United States from Mexico in the late 1960s with the passage of the Hart-Celler Act. This change in U.S. immigration policy coincided with the popular renewal of the use of pre-Columbian tropes in Mexican popular culture. It hadn't gone away, it was a rise that significantly affected migrant Mexican culture in the U.S. The hosting of the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City provided the impetus and opportunity for government officials to disseminate romantic representations of the indigenous cultural patrimony, not only to the nation itself, but to the world. Subsequent archaeological discoveries, such as the dramatic unearthing of the massive stone sculpture of the goddess Coyolxauhqui and the excavation of the Aztec Templo Mayor, both occurring in the very center of the capital in the 1970s, further incited public enthusiasm for the use of the pre-Columbian past in representations of Mexicanness. However, this heightened national consciousness came into being against the backdrop of a number of repressive governmental actions, perhaps most notably the Tlatelolco massacre that occurred 10 days before the opening of the Olympic Games. In response to this and many other confrontations, Mexican activists increasingly employed indigenous nationalist emblems against the state, imbuing them with countercultural and revolutionary significance. These events in Mexico, as well as the northward migration of politicized Mexican youth, helped to give shape to the nascent Chicanx movement in the United States. In the process of creating a social space for themselves that would exist betwixt and between U.S. and Mexican national cultures, the movement reinterpreted pre-Columbian iconography and mythology to fit contemporary concerns. Thus, Mesoamerican topoi became central to the elaboration of new and radical forms of ethnic Mexican self-ascription. This was accomplished most powerfully through the redefinition of Aztlán, our favorite journal, the mythic homeland, the mythic homeland of the Aztecs into a geographic metaphor for the Mexican lands lost to the United States, and a spiritual metaphor for the unity of all Chicanas and Chicanos. It was a central idea in the powerful creation of an imagined community. So first articulated by Jack Forbes, an indigenous activist and professor at UC Davis, about 54 years ago, which last night, as I was thinking about this, is about as long as the Spanish colonial period. So we've, anyway, so we've had Aztlán as long as the mission area. And later popularized through Floricanto. Aztlán became a multivalent symbol that provocatively located the legendary wellspring of Aztec/Mexica, or Mexican culture, outside of the nation in El México de afuera, that is to say, Greater Mexico, serving as a counter to Mexican nationals' criticisms of expatriates as traitors or pochos for leaving their motherland and culture. Even more significantly, it provided the basis for claims of spiritual link to indigenous culture and a prior, more legitimate connection to the lands of the Southwest than that of the Anglos and their connection to the missions. Thus, the idea of Aztlán as the Chicano homeland implicitly undermined the dominant narrative taught in schools and lived in public spaces that portrayed Anglo-Americans as the rightful heirs to bucolic Spanish mission colonies. And it was and is a powerful assertion of an imagined community resulting in a counter-hegemonic good. Now to wrap up, as a field, Chicanx studies obviously has the responsibility to assert the fact of local indigenous survivance. I would like to give thanks and credit to the organizers of the conference, the Chicano Studies Research Center, and the Critical Missions Studies Project for doing that here. Critical Mission Studies has the opportunity to become a field that promotes an anti-colonial method for undoing assertions of community that are locked into broad North American colonial mythologies, putting Spanish versus Aztec over and over again. Putting local indigenous people at the center of the public and scholarly narratives about the missions, rather than at the periphery of myths, and recognizing their survival will, it seems to me, likely be the most productive form of resistance to the fantasy mission path and the illusion of the native present. Thank you.
So we're gonna make a slight change to the order of things, and we're gonna ask Dr. Francisco López Morales to come up. And then when he's done, we'll have Q&A.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
To see.
And where is the, here?
Nos sentamos juntos, ¿no?
Sí. He wants, or we can see, okay, nos podemos sentar aquí.
It is my privilege to introduce this remarkable gentleman and scholar, and the question is not what he's done, the question is what hasn't he done. Dr. Francisco López Morales is the former director of World Heritage for Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History. He holds a PhD in urban planning for the University of Grenoble and is a practicing architect. He has published a number of books on cultural landscapes, vernacular architecture, and Mexican heritage. He has many years of service in the International Council on Monuments and Sites and has been involved in World Heritage since 1995. He has particular knowledge of the importance of the missions of in California, both Alta and Baja, and we are honored to have him with us today to finish off this conference, which, and I'll remind you of the title, American Art and Legacy of Conquest, Art at California Missions in the Global 18th to 20th Centuries. And so please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be part of this important conference. And then I have the privilege to share with you some of the points of view for the future of the project between Mexico and the USA. I'm making my, I want to be translate because my English is not so fluently, but yes, but I think we arrive in this moment to have the whole discussion between these 2 days. And they say many important things, and I think we are going ahead with this purpose to have the whole vision about the mission of California. And what are the elements to be added at the end of our task to build together. Okay.
Yeah.
Excuse me, I have one thing to remind you that for us is very important for this project. The recently died from Miguel León Portilla, who was one of the pioneers to believe in this kind of research. So, and also the painter of Oaxaca, ¿cómo se llama? Toledo, Francisco Toledo, who I think he is very muy próximo, very near of the sensitive of this kind of projects. I believe that we must make an homage for León Portilla, because he's one of the most gigantes. Yes. Oh, yes, the greatest researchers and who believes in that America, mainly.
What else do you want? ¿Qué quieres decir?
No, nada, que vamos a comenzar con cómo se...
Okay, he would like to talk about the history of the missions in the research that he has been doing for many years too, as part of the Patrimonio, history of Patrimonio in Mexico.
No, sí, pero, okay. So the reason why I'm so enthusiastic is because we are building a very strong project of research between the States and Mexico. I believe that it goes in the same way of to strengthen the global strategy for one international organism like UNESCO. So I think we must to work together for the future, for the next future, this project. We must be sure about the values of this project, because these projects show the importance to rebuild and to reframe the history. Sí. Sí. Aquí están los valores bajo los cuales tenemos.
Sí, se está proyectando ahí. Ajá.
In the last exercise we do with the project, we put together what are the main points of the criteria to write all the dossier, all the file. Sí. Pero tú.
Okay. The main criteria that he's talking about, and you can look at the PowerPoint, he says that the general history of how the first missions came to the California and the process of the importance of the Camino Real de las Californias. As you already said, the missions were places where not only the evangelization was created, but also a place where financial and places where many other things were going on. Those places were called also the presidios, and it was part of the reorganization of the people who coming from Europe and the people who were from here. Well, all of these you already know, so maybe it's important to pass. I think what is important to say is the proposal who is coming from the UNESCO or the idea that it's from INA in Mexico, and probably you can talk a little bit more about that proposal.
Yes. No, I want to underline mainly, and I put here the purpose, is that the cultural roots are underrepresented on the World Heritage List. So that's the reason why we believe that this project has a lot of possibility to be recognized, but in all the policy of this convention. I'm really convinced that if we want to describe the north part, or the upper California and the Baja California, is really to represent not only the cultural roots, which is very important, but mainly because it's the proof of our exchange, cultural exchange and economic exchange, and the future to recognize what are the cultural values between both histories.
The criteria using for the nomination mainly emphasize in the development of architecture, technology, monumental art, the buildings, urbanism, and landscaping. That's are the terms that they are considered very significant for the nomination. That's why he considered important to focus again in the conservation under this big organization who cares about the patrimony of the whole world, and especially because we share this as a binational program or binational project between Mexico and the United States. And well, those are the mainly ones.
Harry Crosby continued to do this exercise, and then we continue also in Mexico last month to retake the dialogue between the population that are in that territory and and also the research who are in the INA and also other institutes to review and to listen carefully what happened with the history, and if we are in the right sense to reframe and to write again the the draft of this paper, because we need to have the states and Mexico also. We need to have a very dialogue with the international organisms like UNESCO, but only with other organisms who are very interesting to recognize the common history. Maybe I'm very, I apologize for my English, but I do believe that this is a very, very important project for our institution, not only because we are in USLA here in the university, but also because we have a lot of groups gathered to retake all the narrative.
In the next one, it says that why is important to conserve or to preserve this information in the misiones, because they have a traditional and cultural who is continue alive, and because it's important to preserve the testimony of the many people who pass by the missions, and where we share a history. Another criteria, it's because of the material that you can find inside. I believe some information or archives related to the important events that happened in the past, but we continue as a tradition. And also ideas and beliefs that are part of art and literature about that important events in the past. This is important also because of the environmental ideas of how we can protect the patrimony in the ways of mechanisms that we can create between the both countries. And this idea of submit the project, it will be under the criteria of mixed patrimony. That means cultural and like and natural. Mm-hmm.
It's difficult to do that, and it's very risky, but we believe that we can get this proposal from the both countries.
Again, it's important to create, I believe, a commission where you can identify which are the important points to could submit this project. From the Mexican side, there is a progress about that. Last year, almost was completed the form to submit, but the INA decided not to do it because they wanted to do it together. Because if one side of the for example, if Mexico continue in the future, it will be more difficult to put together. Yeah, that's why they wanted to wait a little bit until you were prepared for the continue with the conversation. Uh-huh.
Is there more to maybe say about the general project, or would it be more helpful if we did questions about the project? At this point, is there more?
Yeah, I believe it's good if we continue with the questions. Uh-huh. Yeah.
I just wanted to say something. I'm on the stool. That's the, because so the University of California and the Office of the President, Jen Napolitano, had been, really wanting the University of California to take a lead on the California side of this project, and. One of the obstacles that we basically stopped the University of California's participation in that, because so many of California tribal nations were opposed to the possibility, or worried about the possibility of this leading to kind of a celebratory picture. And so the question that we had been left with, and that perhaps there's a way forward, is how do we have a critical, so to think about, so that for the application from our side, to have that critical interrogation, so that they could be, so we had wanted, proposed, and the proposal is still on the table, to work with the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience around that, and that's something that there has been reception. Val López, for example, of the Alma Mutsun, was interested in beginning a conversation with the International Coalition, so that and the model that they were suggesting for the California missions was along the lines of the Maison d'Esclaves, which was in your photo. Yeah, which was a collaboration between UNESCO, World Heritage, and the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, and that's the slave museum and the slave routes. So that, and I think the example of plantations was also really relevant. So the idea, and I think the problem that's hard is that I don't think we've had in the United States, we don't have any sites, UNESCO World Heritage sites, that are also sites of conscience. I don't think we have a, so as you said, it's this so important, and yet there's so many obstacles, and one of those obstacles is the nationalist discourse, right? The nationalist discourse is an obstacle to a truly meaningful reinterpretation that would allow for that, and that would maybe would resonate with California tribal nations. Yeah.
You know why this project is very important? Because ICOMOS, International ICOMOS, made recently one book building the gaps of the World Heritage List. And one of the points which is lack in this World Heritage List is the cultural roots. So this is an underrepresentative list. So that's why I believe that this is our nuestra our interest to do that exercise.
I would like to add something more than question. It's a comment, and I for Cynthia. I was really enjoying your presentation because I think you make a very good resume about what is going on during these conversations in these days, and I believe that you didn't use that word, but I consider that talking about conciliation in the way to look forward and to continue with this conversation, to put a focus on one thing that is very important to continue, it's the conservation of the Patrimonio, even though we have different ways of seeing the history and the way that it was actually. But to put on the table this information and the way to look the way how we can continue with this. So thank you.
I mean, commenting also on what Jennifer was saying, I don't think is an easy path, and it's going to be a rather really long path until, for example, any nomination is achieved. And I think even before we could think about the missions being nominated for one of these sites of conscious, probably it will be necessary to have like 2 or 3 or 4 steps before that, because the international organization for these sites is very contested, is very political. Of course, it needs to be, but in my humble understanding of where you are at, it seems that there are many steps that will need to be taken beforehand. As we say, it's like querer correr sin gatear primero. It's a bit like that. Like it is a long way, and probably none of us in this room will be able to effect those changes, because a lot of like trust building will need to be in the first place established with communities. So yeah, I want to believe that conciliation is possible, but it is a rocky road. And I think in Mexico we also have a very difficult path, despite having INA, despite all the things I mentioned. I think even in our missions and in many heritage places, we're not having these discussions. And so we're going to have to sort all those difficulties, for example, of having a big centralized body that might be unsurmountable. And perhaps in that way you have some more flexibility. Who knows? But I don't think it's going to be soon. But I don't think that we shouldn't do anything just because it's not going to be much.
Oh, hi, Cynthia. I think we'll have a chance to talk about this tomorrow if you're coming to San Gabriel. Eve Chavez and I have served on the board, the Mission Museum Board at San Gabriel, and I think what would be helpful for us is to understand, in a practical sense, what are some of these first steps. Like, we're still in the process really of haven't even completed inventorying all the objects. What would you recommend? You know, you're saying like we have a long way to go, but is there something that some of the missions at least we could begin?
I think we must to go with the natural processes, and then maybe to force some of the lines, but keeping in mind that there are these kind of works waiting to be added to the whole text, because the whole text in this file will be a little bit difficult, and we must discuss the the contents of the proposal of the text is not for tomorrow.
Well, I would love to know exactly where you are at, and of course we're looking forward very much for listening really to all the work that has been done. And I would say that the fact that you are already in or working with the Mission San Gabriel and already thinking about next steps, it's a sign that it's a place where there is some openness for change. So that in itself, it's very positive. And I think more than me or you or any one of us saying where we have to go, I think the next step would have to be along the lines of collectively deciding where do we want to go. And within that process, I do think that identifying all stakeholders is very important. So having a really robust understanding of all the communities that might be involved, whether indigenous or not, be very aware of like power relations, because that's going to set the terms of who's on the table and on what terms. And that in itself might be something that can take a year or two, but in previous experiences, if you get that right, whatever comes next will be possible, because then there will be a group of people collectively aimed at achieving something with an agreement of respect and understanding. If we don't get that right, there are also many experiences that will mess up unnecessarily. So there are things that it is worth investing a lot of time early on, despite we wanted to see, for example, quick changes in interpretation. Of course, we'd love to see the sites in themselves being interpreted differently and other voices, but before we go to that interesting part of it, we need to do all this background work, I think. But I'd love to know where you're at, definitely, before saying anything else.
Yes. I have to say that for some reason, I'm still not sure whether these places can be a museum or can be conceived as a museum. I don't know, I feel that perhaps in some of the missions are exhibitions, but it doesn't matter, because actually I think that the questions and the approaches that you presented, Cynthia, have been used on a side scale. So I think that there is a route there that we could just use to approach these sites as heritage, because I think that that's the main issue, how these sites are now conceived as heritage and whose heritage it is, and how this heritage is going to be even constructed in terms of the inventories, for example. What are the labels that we are going to use to build the inventories? What are the practices, conservation practices that we are going to use in order to be inclusive? So I think that what are the histories that we want to, the kind of research, do we want to do comparative stories that include Chicano people, Mexican people, indigenous people? So I do think that, that there is a route, and on a bright side, yes. I think that it's possible to move forward and to perhaps design like a program that, on the one hand, bring us together, and on the other hand, help us to experiment perhaps approaches that have been used before or in other places to deal with people-centered approaches to heritage. So we are not really in a vacuum. There are some experience that might be useful to approach this case, which of course is unique, but I think that it's possible to also gain some experience from other peoples that have been in similar situations.
Yes, of course. We are sure that we are not in a vacuum. We have a lot of history and a lot of experience in this sense, because the project not start yesterday. See, I don't know how many years though we have making this exercise.
Decades, no?
Decades, yes. So is the time to take some of the decisions, preliminary decision, what is gonna be part of the file between the states and between Mexico. And that's why, you know, the UNESCO has they have take note about our exercise. So this is a foot step ahead of this route. But they are, excuse me, they are very enthusiastic to push us to do this exercise. They believe that the project is very strong.
That, you know, just regarding this, and then we can maybe move on to questions for some of our other speakers. But you know, when the Obama administration closed up shop, right? They finalized a bunch of nominations from the tentative list, and so the tentative list is, so they did it real fast, right? And so the list is sort of closed. Our tentative list is closed now, probably for almost a decade. So that, you know, so one idea that we had with the University of California is that we would file a sort of, how do you say it, amicus brief? Yeah, directly, like we would just file directly, and that could be co-authored somehow, right, with the diverse stakeholders and with California Indian tribal nations who are interested in participating with that. And it could be a statement, a summary statement that could be sent directly to UNESCO and sort of circumventing our national processes, which are sort of bogged down also with a particular person in Washington, D.C., right? So that's the last thing that I was going to say. Other questions? Other panelists?
Hello, and thank you for this lively discussion. This was really great. Everyone on this panel, including the workshop, were very helpful for this day. I don't have another question for the other panelists, but I think in a general question about the misiones, the missions, I noticed that in both days we're focusing on the very prominent ones in located near major cities, like Misión Dolores near San Francisco. We've got San Gabriel, San Fernando. But, and thankfully someone actually brought up San Juan Bautista, which is where I'm from in that area. But I'm also interested in, you're also investigating the misiones and asistencias that are very rural in areas like Soledad, which is in an area that I know of in Salinas, or San Antonio, which is also not far from that area near like Paso Robles area. Or even Redlands, which is where I used to live. There's an asistencia out there outside of the San Bernardino area. So I was curious if this involves all aspects of the misiones, including the ones that no one really goes to visit or even knows that exist.
line coming up for critical mission studies, and we would love to fund that kind of research. So we just had a grant deadline end of June and gave out couple hundred, over $300,000 in grants. So the next deadline is coming up end of this month with a deadline in mid-January, and grad students, UC faculty, non-UC faculty, postdocs, community-initiated partnerships. So there's another deadline, but we are precisely interested in that kind of work. So. We're sort of calling the state, right? Yeah, we're like, submit, please. We had amazing, I mean, the applications were amazing. And one of the grad students on the stage was funded, and and the incredible community-initiated partnerships.
I want to share with you the recent experience that we have till 1900s, in the beginning, when we scribed the Camino Real o Tierra Adentro, it was a moment to decide if we stop here this, because if you look for the future, it's unfinished. So you must be clear with the researchers, of course, and the communities, what are the limits to consider to the cultural roots, because if not, you are in an immensity territory that it never ends. So we must have clear that this kind of projects has a very limited, very clear, not to open in in exercise without finish.
Okay, question back here. Yep.
Yeah. I wanted to follow up on the earlier question and emphasize your response. I think we began this conference with the observation that we have to make an analytical distinction between the missions and a multiplicity of indigenous cultures, as well as the diversity of cultures functioning under the rubric of the United States. And I think, what you emphasize, and I think it's part of what's important or in advance about the Critical Mission Studies project, is to really open up the full range of access points to getting the support to not be responsive to a call that the project has made, come do this for us, but to leave it open so that the field can more broadly begin to define the particulars of research-based projects. And again, whether you're working within the context of an institution or not. And I think that's the second significant point that came up in this panel. And in particular, I think through really the very kind of important delineation that Cynthia gave, is to also draw a distinction between efforts that are located within institutional contexts, and to be very self-conscious about those contexts, and those that are positioning themselves as a critique or a deconstruction or an alternative to the institutional context within which we understand certain things about our past and present. So that's just kind of to throw it more widely open. But I think that what everyone on the stage has been kind of emphasizing in their talks or in this discussion as well is that there is that very tricky issue of finding and defining the relationships between all the various people that are trying to address this in one way or another. We may align in certain broad features, but there are also going to be necessary conflicts and differences of perspective in doing that. And since Jorge kind of summarized what I had said over lunch. I'm going to summarize what Joanne here said earlier. That feeling of coming into a conference like this, which has been very stimulating, is to realize all the things you don't know and to realize the ways in which it challenges what you think you know. And I think that for me, at least, and a number of other people, that's a really helpful thing going forward, because it puts you back into the world. And I think a lot of times we get trapped within the disciplinary and institutional frameworks we work in, whether it's a university, a museum, a cultural center, or some organized sense of a community, that it's useful to kind of have that kind of challenged and broadened by seeing where other people are coming at it that aren't necessarily at odds with you, but they're not the same as well. So.
Thank you so much. I'm going to wrap things up since we've had a really intense 2.5 days. Thank the panels so much for these final thoughts, and just offer a few closing thoughts. We go to a lot of conferences. We all organize lots of things. This is a conference I'll really remember for some powerful moments of making new knowledge. That doesn't happen very often. You actually make new knowledge that we're literally crafting together here, new theoretical and methodological paradigms, and realizing what we don't know. So I'm very grateful for the intellectual work that we've done over the last 2 days. I want to recognize the 2 keynotes, which were perfect, so perfect to see someone trying to articulate an indigenous art history to study the missions was powerful. That you're a Bruin makes me very proud. Jorge's incredible talk that made me rethink comparative approaches and think about how we can challenge the sources that we think of as primary sources. Every panel was so stimulating. That first panel, I was so excited by the objects that we saw, the kinds of documentary primary source research. I'm like, there's still so much to do. I was just thrilled by that. The round table that we ended with yesterday and that difficult conversation, like, I'm thrilled that we had that. It's time that we begin having those conversations. The panel this morning reminding us of this global context. It's not just California, and it's not just Mexico, and it's not just that division between Aztec and Spanish, that it's a global world, and it's a really very complicated story. The workshop this afternoon was powerful, really important for us to hear. I've struggled with as someone, well, when I'm working on the 17th century, do I need to be talking with indigenous peoples about these artworks? And the answer is yes. So that was a really important moment, I think, for many of us. And then the final panel, just like couldn't have been more perfect. Everybody moving forward in new ways, in different ways. And then Dr. López, your comments and Jennifer's. So I'll give you one final word, yes, and then we're gonna end and go to dinner.
2 more words.
Okay.
No. I want to underline and to tell you that we have the opportunity and the freedom to fix what are the limits. We have one guide, one framework, but it is not necessary to be completed, because if you know, the Silk Road is a huge project. So we take step by step, in different etaps. So we must have clear that there is a big experience for the cultural roots in the World Heritage List. So we must take and we must discuss what are our choices.
Thank you. With that, thank you.